Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our toolbox session today. We'll go ahead and take a couple moments here and wait for folks to get logged on, but we're really happy that you've joined us this morning for our community-led engagement efforts webinar today. At this time, I'll go ahead and ask Michaela to share the poll so we can just take a couple of moments and learn a little bit about who's attending the webinar today. And again, we'll just take a few moments and let folks log on, and we'll start here in a minute or two. All right, I think we can go ahead and stop the poll at this time and we'll kick this webinar off. So once again, thank you all so much for joining us this morning. My name is Katie Enders and I am an associate planner at the Puget Sound Regional Council, and we're really excited to have you here today. We have some staff from PSRC along with our consultant from Uncommon Bridges and an EAC Equity Advisory Committee member with us today. So we're really excited. I'll start off just by giving you a little bit of information about the Toolbox series. Toolbox is a quarterly webinar series that's focused on sharing best practices and resources for local planning. And really the idea here is that coming together, sharing what we've learned, things that have worked for us is one way that we can add another tool to our toolbox in planning. So thank you again for joining us. And once again, my name is Katie. If you have any questions about Toolbox, ideas for future sessions, or comments, you can always reach me at my email. I also wanted to take a moment to give you a teaser for our next Toolbox session. So we do have a session scheduled November 7th, so you can mark your calendars for that. That session is going to be focused on transportation safety planning. So we're really looking forward to that session. And actually a lot of the engagement work that we'll be talking about today, some of that was in support of PSRC's Regional Safety Action Plan. And that plan was adopted by our board at the General Assembly last May, and we're really excited to talk about that work. And we know there's also a lot of great transportation safety work happening in your communities around the region. So we'll be looking forward to sharing some of that work in November. But as for today, a couple of logistics before we dive in. If you have any questions, please feel free to enter those in the Q&A box. We also got a lot of great questions before the webinar, so I already have a list of some of those questions. We'll have a Q&A at the end of the session. If you are an AICP planner, we have an equity CM credit that is available for you at the end of today's session, so we'll have more information about that. And then finally, we always have a session evaluation and our Title VI survey at the end of the webinar, so please stick around for those. We really value that feedback. We have some session resources that are available. So the webinar is being recorded and that will be available later. We'll also make sure that we distribute presentations after this webinar. I'll send a follow-up email sometime next week to everybody that registered. We also have a community-led engagement efforts handout that we put together. So that is available on PSRC's website. And once I stop sharing my screen here in a moment, I'll drop a link in the chat so that you can access that if you would like. And that has some links to different resources that will be discussed in the webinar today, as well as some additional resources that we thought you might be interested in. So without further ado, we can dive into today's session. I'm really excited to have on the call with me today Noah Bogus, who is our Senior Public Engagement Specialist at PSRC. We're joined by Ariam Ford, who's the Equity and Engagement Lead at Uncommon Bridges, our consultant we've been working with. And we're also really happy to have Julia Janin Shields, who is the Regional Planning, Equity, and Engagement Program Manager at King County. But for today, she's going to be talking about her experience serving as one of PSRC's Equity Advisory Co-Chairs, or Equity Advisory Committee Co-Chairs. And we're really excited to hear about her experience there. Like I mentioned, we'll have a Q&A at the end of the session, and then I'll come back on and close out the session around 11:30. So I will stop sharing my screen and we'll ask Noah to come online, and we're excited to hear from you.
Good morning, everyone. As Katie mentioned, I'm the public engagement specialist at PSRC. So my job is to kind of coordinate all of our outreach and engagement activities um, across our agency when we're doing various planning perspectives and initiatives. Get a minute here to set up my presentation. So today I'm going to talk about kind of the evolution of engagement processes at PSRC, what they're looking like now, some efforts that we've made in the last few years to really step up our equitable engagement and engagement processes that are led alongside and with community members. And then I'll talk about some initiatives that we're looking forward to as we continue to try to expand these processes as we move forward. But kind of like to set this stage a little bit about what engagement has looked like at PSRC in years past. These are some of our oldest plans that we've made: Destination 2030 and Transportation 2040. Very few members of our staff were on hand when we did these larger engagement or planning initiatives way back in the day, but I bring up these old, grainy, sort of ridiculous photos to just share the fact that engagement, kind of as a philosophy and a strategy, has really come a long way since these plans were put together. I think these are 20, 30 years old or so. And I won't name names, but there's a handful of staff members who are still at PSRC from when these plans were being made. And they've shared with us some of the perspective that our agency has had when we were doing some of these larger initiatives, kind of at the beginning of our agency into the early 2000s. Many of you know that PSRC serves as a convener of governments in the region, our county, ports, cities, tribal partners. We like to bring folks together to share best practices and kind of talk about things and initiatives that we have to move the region forward. Back 20 years or so ago, our boards and our leadership didn't really see engagement as a big part of the work that PSRC does. They thought that that was the responsibility more so of the local governments themselves, who are interacting day to day with these community members, um, who they probably, frankly, recognize a little bit better. Sometimes when we're doing engagement, it can be difficult to explain who we are as a metropolitan planning organization. And our role was really to support those local partners, provide data, policy direction, and information sharing. I think as time has gone by, we have learned that that's really not necessarily an effective thing for us to do. As a government agency, we need to continue to build local relationships, engage with community more and more, especially since our planning and our policy work and our transportation funding processes especially affect communities directly. We're not just a convener of governments. We have lots of charges and responsibilities in our own right, and we need to find ways that we can continue to directly coordinate with community. As we kind of moved out of this perspective that we should be moving toward a perspective where we should be engaging with communities directly, the individual teams and departments at the agency sort of directly engage community for their individual plans. For example, when we would do a regional transportation plan, the transportation planning team would kind of handle that. For our vision long range plans, our growth management planning team would handle engagement for that, et cetera. But there wasn't sort of a cohesive set of guidelines or a team that was consistently doing engagement. That really started to shift and move in a different direction through our racial equity strategy. This was a post-pandemic effort that led to quite a few initiatives at our agency, but several that were directly related to engagement. The regional equity strategy created our racial equity action plan that I'll talk about in a moment. And it also created a full-time staff position to exclusively focus on engagement. Not to bury the lead here, but I am that person. My role did not exist until I moved into that about 3 years ago. So that was the first sort of FTE appointment that the agency had, specifically thinking about how to engage with community. So I talked a little bit about the Racial Equity Action Plan. It's in its second iteration now, but when we first started rolling with it in 2019, it had these 4 categories that made these 13 teams, I believe. It's a suite of resources co-created alongside our Equity Advisory Committee that provides guidance and help our members and staff push towards the region's equity goals. Community engagement is a huge pillar of that, but also capacity building within our agency, sharing some best practices, and then expanding our data and research initiatives as well. Obviously, the community engagement portion is the most significant way that we have moved forward as an agency to expand our outreach and engagement initiatives. But I'm also going to talk a little bit about that hiring and retention team as well. The hiring and retention team was a group of our staff members that put their heads together to think about how we can hire more diverse workforce members to kind of build out an agency from a staffing perspective that represents the communities that we serve. An initiative that came out of that is our Youth Leadership Development Academy, the Summer Planning Academy that I'll talk about in a minute. But I'm going to go through these 4 initiatives that I have highlighted here and talk about how those have sort of fed this progression of moving towards more community-led engagement initiatives. The Equity Advisory Committee is sort of PSRC's iteration of a citizen advisory committee that co-creates products with our staff and an executive board. They review all of our work plans and processes and provide guidance to move our work in a more equitable position. We meet monthly for these committees as a entire committee, but we've also created a model that I think is pretty interesting of subcommittees for certain projects. So we have a few examples of these where we have asked individuals from the Equity Advisory Committee to volunteer some of their time to meet with and alongside our staff members during our regular meeting hours. Few examples of this were our equity pilot project for our project selection process a couple years ago. The Equity Advisory Committee was in charge of $6 million that they had full autonomy to decide which transportation projects were funded with that. So we brought them into a lot of our meetings to understand how we have assessed and scored projects in the past and sort of developed a new model for selecting equity-related projects. We've also had a subcommittee for the creation of our demographic profile interactive report that's going to be coming online in a little bit, and a subcommittee specifically thinking about engagement for our regional transportation plan that my colleague Ariam will talk about in a moment here. But the Equity Advisory Committee is great because it has representation from across sectors. So it's not just folks who have worked in government for the majority of their career. They're coming from the business sector, private sector, nonprofit, and really kind of giving us some different angles to think about as part of our work planning. Another initiative that came out of this Racial Equity Action Plan was our Anti-Displacement Organizations report. So we were basically thinking about ways as a regional agency that we can kind of assist individual organizations that are already trying to combat displacement across the region. So we created a directory to connect our member agencies and other interested parties to CBOs that have long been doing this work. It involved a large outreach push with CBOs as we scanned the region to find community groups that were working in this space. And it also was a nice way to just understand the CBO landscape in the Puget Sound a little bit more and put together some ongoing engagement and relationships that we have with some of these groups now. Alongside our anti-displacement organizations report, we also had a team from our Racial Equity Action Plan that put together guidance for equitable engagement. This is a document that details how you can increase engagement, increase equity and engagement. There's 2 products that came out of this. Hopefully some of you have seen some of these, but The first one was equitable engagement guidance for the comprehensive planning process. So this was a project that we put together to distribute to our member jurisdictions that were going through their comprehensive plans to give them some steps and some guidance and some best practices about how they can connect with community in a more equitable way. And then we also detailed a document that has best practices for our staff. It goes through a range of engagement activities that we often undertake as an MPO and talks about ways to promote equity in those outreach efforts. It goes across a few different categories, including the content that we create, how we distribute materials, events that we hold, and how to increase participation and make them more welcoming spaces, visuals that we put out, and other aspects such as our community compensation policies as well. The last one that I'll talk about here is our Summer Planning Academy. We're actually getting ready for our third annual Summer Planning Academy here in about 2 weeks, but this is a youth leadership development academy. It introduces the planning profession to high school students across the region. It's open to any high school student that either lives in or attends a high school in any of our 4 counties. It was developed in 2023, and since then we've had 25 students take place annually in the 4-day academy. The curriculum is pretty set for that. We introduce them to the planning profession, and then we talk about transportation planning, housing planning, environmental planning, and then weave principles of equity throughout that. The goal of this is to open up pathways to the planning profession to individuals who do not already have it. So really thinking about high schools that maybe don't have a strong connection to college planning programs, individuals who maybe don't have an opportunity to participate in a citywide youth council or something like that, thinking about how we can mindfully recruit from high schools that might not already have programs like this for students. This has also been a really great way to get young people involved in the rest of our work planning processes. We have had members of our Summer Planning Academy go on to participate in the Equity Advisory Committee. We also have a year-long intern who was a high school student during the first year of this, who's gone on to help a lot of our planning and outreach processes as well. This is one of the closest projects that I'm involved with during my work planning each year. So a couple more photos of this. This is our students last year going on a tour of the redeveloped Roosevelt Light Rail Station up in North Seattle, talking about TOD initiatives that came out of that construction. It's a large facility that needed a lot of space when they built the station itself. And once all of the equipment and machinery was gone from those staging areas, they put together a residential building there that has affordable units, daycare spaces, commercial spaces as well. All of our students that go through the Summer Planning Academy have to put together a project at the end that analyzes a regional growth center within the city and does some data analysis and statistics on that. So here's a group from last year giving a presentation on the First Hill Growth Center in Seattle. They ran some numbers on housing tenure, just kind of introduced them to the ways that planners think about community spaces. And then lastly here, a nice photo with Mayor Becky Erickson of Poulsbo with the students receiving their certificates. So that's perhaps our most long-lasting kind of initiative that we've put together to engage in spaces that we haven't before. So after we came out of this, sort of process when we were trying to establish better planning principles, it was a couple years before we undertook a really large planning initiative, before we had an opportunity to test some of these guidance documents and things that we had put together. The first big initiative that we did was last year, the Regional Safety Action Plan. Hopefully some of you are familiar with this. It was adopted by our General Assembly just a couple of months ago. This was the result of a Safe Streets and Roads for All grant. It included a comprehensive list of strategies to promote safety across the region, a local jurisdiction policy inventory that communities can take a look at and adapt certain policies to fit the needs of their communities. And then a pretty extensive comprehensive engagement report from a very large initiative that we did across the region. My partner, Ariam, who is here today, is a representative of Uncommon Bridges. Due to the size, scope, and timing for this effort, we put out a request for proposals for consultant assistance. We reviewed some firms and selected Uncommon Bridges in March of last year. We were really impressed with the proposal that they put together. Excuse me, but also they had extensive experience doing equitable engagement alongside government actors before. A good example of this is the community compensation guidelines that they put together with the Washington State Office of Equity. So we saw this as an opportunity not only to expand the scope that we have as an agency to do outreach, but also learn from some partners who have done quite a lot of this work before and can teach us some things about how we can incorporate better engagement principles into our usual planning processes. As I mentioned in a slide previously, we put together best practices and equitable engagement guidance document for our staff. Apologies for the small font here, but this is a list of all of those best practices that we put together from content. I'm not sure why it's auto moving forward, apologies. From creating content to distributing our materials, we put all of this into our request for proposals as well. So when Ariam and team applied to be a part of this, they baked all of that into their application as well. And we were really able to kind of weave those principles into the process at an early stage. These are all of the public involvement touch points that we put together as part of this. Community events last summer, we had 17 community events and tablings that we went to from things like farmers markets, car shows all across the region, an online engagement hub that had more than 1,200 responses, regional public meetings, one in each of our 4 counties, focus groups and interviews, internal briefings with our boards and committees, followed by a public comment process and a public opinion survey that served as kind of a bridge between our safety action plan that we completed and our regional transportation plan that we're working on now, and Ariam will talk a little bit more about. I wanted to include here just a small snippet of why we did so many approaches, perhaps what the goals were behind all of those. Community events were a way to promote awareness of the project, meeting communities where they are, introducing ourselves as a planning agency and making them aware of our work. The online hub is a way to cast a wide and accessible net that individuals can answer on their own time. The regional public meetings was an opportunity to collaborate with community, workshop some approaches and strategies to promote safety. Our focus groups and interviews were ways to dive deep into unique perspectives. Our focus groups, we had one for each of our 4 counties, but then we also had specific focus groups for individuals who live in rural areas. Our tribal partners were able to come together and have a focus group specific to their needs. And then we had one for law enforcement individuals as well to talk about their perspective into safety. Internal briefings are ways that we can bring our boards and committees along in this process. Our public comment process allows the broader public to review our draft plan. And then the public opinion survey is a way to reset the baseline understanding of the system and just really get a lot of responses into how people are understanding safety and how they're using the transportation system. The public meetings were a really big success and something that as an agency we had not really been able to do on a large scale before, and something that I think partnering with our consultants were a really big value add. That table up in the upper left is a really good example. That table has members of ours. It's doing it again, apologies. It has members of our staff. It has an elected official there. There's a transportation engineer, and there's members of community as well. So we are really able to kind of spread out our maps and resources there, have conversations about what's appropriate for specific interventions and what might not be. We presented a lot of data when people came through the door when they first started attending these public meetings, so they could kind of spend 30 or 45 minutes as an open house sort of setting, getting familiar with our findings and statistics before we sat down and had a conversation. All of these were featuring local artists. This could be a performer. In this case, it was a painter from the community that kind of just brought a little more little more interesting aspects into a public meeting. It really removed that sort of kind of stale feeling a lot of people associate with government public meetings, and it made it feel just a little bit more engaging. We asked people to put together pledges as well, what they're willing to do to promote safety on an individual level as well. So it was a great initiative, and we came together at the end of it to kind of talk about some lessons that we learned and things that we wanted to reshape moving forward. The public meetings were great. However, connecting with disengaged community members remains a challenge. We were able to put together these really great rooms and want to keep thinking about ways to get people physically in those rooms to have those conversations with us, especially because our in-person workshop prevents such sorry, that shouldn't be prevent. Our in-person workshops promote such great opportunities to co-create solutions. So we put our heads together to kind of have a conversation about what we can do moving forward, especially as we're thinking about moving into our regional transportation plan. So what's next for us? We are expanding connection to community with 2 new initiatives that we will talk about here. The regional transportation plan engagement is underway now. We are working with Arium and team again. We had a great time with them and wanted to just kind of keep that connection moving forward. And then we're talking after Arium presents about the RTP, I'll talk a little bit about some quick build implementation projects that we're going to hopefully start putting together across the region starting next year. So with that, I will stop my slide share and hand it over to Arium.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. I'm really glad I didn't wear that outfit again. I was tempted. My name is Ariam Ford. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm so excited to be talking about the Regional Transportation Plan and the engagement process that we are undertaking with the Equity Advisory Committee. I'm going to do, as I'm really happy to, as a little bit of a data nerd and GIS person to all my mapping folks out there. I'm going to share with you a quick story about how we got here to engaging the EAC and why we needed to. So what you have on your screen, and something that we're hoping to roll out publicly during the reporting process of a regional transportation plan, but what you have on your screen are the survey results that we were able to achieve during the Regional Safety Action Plan, as far as how many people came to our online hub and submitted a survey, and where, based on zip code, we were able to get a concentration of responsiveness. Now, this was really cool because, you do all this planning, you do all this outreach, you make the flyers, you do the thing, and you want to see how effective was that. And so from across the 4-county region, not the 12-county region, the 4-county region, you can see that the highest concentrations of our Regional Safety Action Plan survey results submitted online were in the Seattle metro or downtown area in King County, but we did have, good representation across other counties. For example, there was 11 surveys here, some other over in Redmond, we had 21 surveys. But what you'll also definitely notice is that there are these huge gaps where there are there's no color, where we may have not received any surveys from those zip codes or any kind of engagement. What we then did with this information is looking at our new new opportunity with PSRC on the Regional Transportation Plan. And as we are making plans for our engagement, our goal is to fill these gaps. And how do we fill those gaps is, we think, through relationships. And so that is a place where the EAC comes in. One place we're hoping the EAC will connect us with is with some of these little dots, which represent community-based organizations that are in these gap areas. Credit to my colleague Carson Bridges, who made this really cool story map and did the research about the community-based organizations based on the state database. And so it's helping us understand this time, as we are creating those outreach materials, how can we parlay and magnify our impact through relationships, identifying specific organizations who can help us get the word out, and then working with groups like the Equity Advisory Committee to to directly engage with those communities and fill those gaps. I'm very excited about a year from now when we have the results of our newest engagement and we are standing up another hub, and how well this worked. But it's definitely allowing us to be much more specific and intentional in addressing not just blanket equity, but trying to get and understand what is stopping people from engaging and how can we address specific needs rather than overarching tactics. The hypothesis being the closer you can get to the grassroots and meet people where they are, the more successful you will be in engaging them and getting good feedback for your process. And so I'll talk a little bit about how that led us to assemble the EAC RTP subcommittee. This is a slide from our onboarding deck we did with the broader Equity Advisory Committee at PSRC, asking folks to opt in to participate in this process with us. As we develop the Regional Transportation Plan Engagement Plan, we wanted to coordinate with Equity Advisory Committee members to make sure we are deeply engaging and to put spotlight on those blind spots that we have as to why aren't we getting engagement from these particular areas. We want to and are co-creating engagement efforts with this committee, understanding that our goal is to reach folks where we haven't before, and to do so are meeting monthly and incentivizing participation using the existing standard that PSRC uses to compensate the EAC. And so we asked them if they were interested in joining our committee. Noah talked a little bit about the engagement process we use for the Regional Safety Action Plan. Very similarly, we have kind of 3 steps in our engagement process. We think about the inputs, which go from all the existing plans, the committees. We do pre-engagement interviews. We do deep analysis of our gaps in the past. And that allows us to understand how we want to engage in this process. We create something called a question set. I really love the idea of a question set. Again, bringing that research process into qualitative analysis, and that outlines the exact kind of premise of what information are we going to share and what information are we going to collect. Question sets, I think, even if I'm going to a conversation with a local leader, I can think about what are the topics that I'm going to talk about or ask about. What's the depth of specificity I'm going to get? Am I going to get into the weeds? Am I going to stay really high level? And then what, particularly for planners in a place-based management perspective, what geography am I talking about? How can I be relevant to what this stakeholder or this person of interest really cares about? With that question set in hand, just generally and starting from the end in mind, what are we trying to collect information about and share information about? We're able to then apply that unified question set across a range of touch points. So what topics am I asking about? What depth of specificity am I asking about? And what is the range of geographic coverage am I asking about? That's a process we've been going through with PSRC for each touch point. How specific are you going to get in the engagement hub? How specific are you getting at a tabling event or regional public meetings? All of this is so that at the end, when we have all that feedback, we can make sure that the feedback we got at a tabling event relates to the feedback we got at a focus group. And we can talk about them kind of in similar terms rather than just in quasi anecdotes. We're trying to avoid community feedback being anecdotes. So using those tactics, this is exactly where the EAC is coming in, because we have to apply our question set to these different touch points. And what's going to bring us together in the most successful way is doing that in a culturally responsive format. I should not take a 50-question survey to a community rodeo. No one's going to fill that out. But EAC members can help us understand what format do we need to take information to people, what format do we need to take inquiries to people so that they see the value in participating, and will then also give us their most valuable asset for us, the information that they have about their preferences and their needs as far as improving quality of life in this perspective through transportation. So that's been really important. And I'm gonna pause. I think I'm gonna stop sharing screen here because I do want to talk a little bit about the feedback that we've been able to collect from the members who opted into our and opted into the subcommittee of the Regional Transportation Plan Equity Advisory Committee. Lots of acronyms, long words, but very important ones. So there's 3 things I'll talk about. We are in the midst of planning 6 large regional public events across the 4-county area, similarly to what Noah shared earlier, being cultural forward. What makes people want to gather in a place and stay for a while? Food, culture, people, engagement. That's what we do know. And that's just about human nature. And so how the challenge is, how can we integrate what we know about human nature into some of these sometimes stiff and stuffy topics? I like to say we're going to have food, we're going to watch a performance, we're going to do all this, and then we're going to talk some about transportation. And that usually resonates with people when you're asking them to come to an event on a summer night or a nice fall night where you're competing with weather and childcare and all of these other things. Time poverty is a big one. What is the opportunity cost? What is someone going to get at your event that they weren't going to get somewhere else? And what are they missing out on that you can maybe integrate into your event so it's more of a double win for those folks who come? And so some things that the members are helping us with is identifying that local talent of venue and caterer and food, caterers and logistics folks, so that we can embed ourselves in community, ideally spend as much of our resources in community and have those resources that we're spending putting on these events stay within the community. Identifying an early what's in it for me when we are contributing to the local economy in that way, and then giving a reason for our vendors to tell other people about this event and why they should come. And so that satellite outreach tactic, they've been giving us some really great feedback about communicating and doing outreach about these events and getting people to sign up. Why should anyone care? That's the question that you're often finding yourselves with engagement activities, especially when you're mandated to do engagement. What we learned is that, particularly on the social media venue or avenues that we're doing communications on, and even in direct outreach, emails, flyers, people need to have recognizable relationships from your communications and what is going on in their daily lives. So we cannot put out the same ad or flyer that in King County that we could in Snohomish County. And that's because they're not locally relevant. And so one of the tactics that you all inspired, whether they know or not, is we're on the hunt for locally relevant issues that we can include or reference in sometimes cheeky ways in our social media that we know people are talking about. And one of the ways that we're really excited to do that through some community research is through mediums like Nextdoor and Reddit. So for example, I don't know how many folks on here are Redditors, but there is an R Kitsap, there's an R Bremerton, there is an R Seattle, I live in Kitsap, so I'm on those. All of these spaces are places where people are engaging and talking about civic activities. And we're going to go through and look, what's going on with the transportation system in this public zeitgeist? And could we reference any of those things that are going on in our ads to make them culturally relevant to the communities? What that means is we've had to highly segment and prepare our marketing plan as far as what post is going to go where, so we can curate that content. But that's something that we think is going to pay really high dividends as far as registrations for events. The last thing I'll touch on is that from a facilitation standpoint, we're really hoping that our engagement equity advisory committee subcommittee members will attend and actually facilitate at some of our regional public meetings and providing training for that. Another reason why we're doing that is because they are the ones who, one, are going to be able to do those invitations to folks they know want to come, using their own networks to bear for PSRC's and the greater region's good, and then wanting to make the communication and the information sharing and the information gathering as culturally relevant as possible. And what better way to do that than having someone from the community doing that information sharing and that information gathering. For that, we are preparing to have facilitator training, just like we do with PSRC's facilitators. A new addition this year that we've brought in based on feedback from the Equity Advisory Committee is to bring on an accessibility consultant who will be reviewing and assessing all of our communications, event planning, and venue and programming for a culture of accessibility and identifying what gaps we need to fill as far as making sure all of our events, all of our communications are not the reason someone cannot participate. And so that was a direct feedback from that was a direct action in because of feedback from Equity Advisory Committee members, and has been really exciting because now that I've implemented that type of contract on a number of my other projects. And so they're having this bigger ripple effect, not just on this project, but the way that we as practitioners do work. So I will pause there and I think introduce our Equity Advisory Committee member who is on the call to talk a little bit about their experience. Hi.
Hi, how you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Good. Happy to be here.
Awesome. So I am in charge of moderating kind of this, one-on-one with you about your experience on the Equity Advisory Committee. And one, please fill in any gaps or misrepresentations that I may have had about the group so far. But I'm really interested for you to share with us when maybe you saw this presentation of us asking y'all to opt in, what made you want to participate?
Yeah, I'll start by talking a little bit about who I am so people can understand like my background and what brought me to PSRC. So, hi everyone, I'm Julia Janin Shields. I'm a community planner based in Seattle, working at the intersection of equitable engagement, urban policy, and community development. I was raised in the San Francisco Bay Area on Ohlone land, and that's really where I witnessed how rapid development can harm underrepresented communities and the environment. And that experience really guided my career towards advancing equity, sustainability, and cultural responsiveness in planning. As mentioned at the start, I currently serve as our Regional Planning Equity and Engagement Program Manager for King County. When I started with PSRC on the Equity Advisory Committee about 3 years ago, I was not in this role. So we can talk a little bit about that. But in that role, I lead efforts to embed equity and community voice into our regional planning initiatives. My approach to the work is deeply influenced through my experience as a project partner with Black Space Urbanist Collective in Brooklyn, New York. So you may hear me refer to our work, also talk about our manifesto. I encourage folks to look up our work. So throughout this space, I may refer to that. But locally, I try to bring this perspective of equity and cultural responsiveness into spaces like this with Puget Sound Regional Council on the Equity Advisory Committee, which I co-chair this year with the lovely Shannon Turner, so of Kitsap, and on the local Seattle Planning Commission. So why was I interested in participating? That was the question, right, Ariam? Okay, long intro. I was excited to participate in the subcommittee and some other subcommittees within the Equity Advisory Committee because I believe really deeply in the power of community-led engagement and the responsibility that we have as planners to co-create with, not for communities, especially those historically left out of decision-making. This has been at the core of my work, starting at a more grassroots level as a community member and now wearing a government hat in my full-time role. But the opportunity with PSRC was exciting because, as you all know, I'm sure, the planning guidance and structure is really hierarchical in process from the state with the Growth Management Act, and then to the regional level with PSRC, to then the county level, and all of that trickle down. And I wanted to ensure that in plans like our regional transportation plan, equity is embedded into each aspect of this work, and it carries through all the way from the top to plan adoption and implementation. So yeah, I really saw this as an opportunity to share lessons learned, and lift up models that are replicable, especially for agencies and jurisdictions looking to move beyond check the box engagement, whether through committees or broad frameworks that embed community voice early and often. And I felt like what a great way to do that then at our regional level throughout the Puget Sound with this plan.
Amazing. Shannon is awesome. The co-chair, you guys, when the first time that we went to the committee meeting, I am inspired by how it runs and how it centers the members first, their well-being, and then what is going on in their communities, and then backs into the work. And so I've already, again, I'm consistently learning from you all and implementing those things elsewhere. And so just really glad that people are opting in to these opportunities, because it makes a difference on practitioners and learning and what we're doing. And so you heard all about our goals for this project and our focus groups and this and that and that. What are you started to talk a little bit about your goals broadly and why you do the work, but do you have any specific goals around regional transportation planning, engagement for this project, or, what are your goals for the rest of the project?
Yeah, I think when it comes to our regional plans, they're so vast and the update isn't frequent, right? So it's really a big opportunity to shape what the future of our region is looking like. Um, One of my goals is to continue building relationships and trust, both within the Equity Advisory Committee. We're recruiting right now, if you know people, or if you are interested, and with the communities impacted by the projects that we're advising on. I think that, as Ariam mentioned, having a committee is super helpful in the sense that you have that consistent relationship building and communication and insight. But that's just one aspect of engagement. We don't represent the entire region of the Puget Sound, right? So how can we scale that further? So that is definitely somewhere that I'm excited about, and getting people to understand what the Puget Sound Regional Council is and how it impacts them. I also want to make sure that the insights and values from the EAC subcommittees show up meaningfully in implementation, which is hard, right? Because we're creating the plan and the report, the frameworks. But as I said, I really would love for that to just be all the way through. And so this plan be as detailed as possible, and equity so deeply embedded into it that that's just going to be part of the work when it's disseminated and people are looking at it to guide their next steps. So that includes things like how we prioritize funding, or whose safety is centered in traffic interventions, or how we evaluate success, ensuring that it's accessible, and prioritizing minoritized community. And I think just maybe the last thing is, hoping we continue to strengthen the infrastructure for equity-focused planning in the region so that this isn't a one-off. It becomes the default of all of our regional plans moving forward.
I really love that you mentioned kind of like what is the through line, how to all the way through implementation, and maybe not implementation, but a piece of the project and was so in the regional safety action plan is the public comment period. And the public comment period is really important because it's this first, like, here's the plan. We want to know what you think. We've done all this work, but it's something's going to get voted on. And what we found important and what we were able to do through the way that we tracked our public comments with demographic questions was to see who was commenting on the plan. What was their background from an aspect of income and demographic, and that's another level of equity. Who's getting a final say, whose comments are phrased in the right way that resonate with policymakers and get acted on and things like that. And so this is something that Noah is really interested in increasing relationships on the grass roots and on the ground and in the grassroots, so that leaders and community interests are represented in the comment period process, and that people understand how important it is to have your voice heard, and that there is a through line there from who is responding to, what happens on the ground. And so I think we have a vision for the Equity Advisory Committee to very much play a huge role in helping us understand and get the word out about public comment and capacity building within the community to engage with a bureaucratic system in such a way that those comments rise to the top. And so I'm really glad that you brought that point up.
Yes, for sure. Can you hear me? I had to do a little switcheroo.
Yeah.
Okay.
And if you had a thought, please share. Yeah.
No, that was you, I think, really hit the nail on the head. I think we are so very much in the weeds of this work as planners, and can you hear the noise in the background?
You're a little gargled just a bit, but I
Okay.
think we're getting the point. And I think folks,
There's
I think we have closed captions on in case
okay.
that, or folks want to use that in case. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, there's some construction in my neighborhood, but you're saying, we're very in the weeds of the work as planners, and I think sometimes, especially as years go by, you don't realize how some of these concepts are just they're really complex. So how can we make it more accessible? Something as simple as breaking down acronyms. Sorry, I'm at the beginning talking about the RTP, PSRC's RTP, EAC. Like there's a lot going on there. So planning 101, building knowledge by creating resources. And if you're not able to print them or disseminate them because of budget, have them virtually or direct folks to PSRC's website. They have plenty of resources. So, you know, not only asking for feedback, but like you're saying, why? What is this? How building that space for community members to understand what it is that we're doing as planners, and most importantly, how it impacts them. That's that really big connection point there.
Absolutely. The why should you care? Why does this matter? And I think that's the power personally that art plays. And I feel like it's artists' jobs is to try to show why you should care about certain concepts or ways of thought,
Mhm.
and to have those things linger in the zeitgeist and carry through over time. And I think that by integrating that into events, and it just becomes more recognizable from a human scale. Oh, I like music. I don't know what we're doing, but I'm here. And we literally were able to do that with some events at the El Centro in Seattle, people coming off the street because there's music and food. And then, oh, there's transportation. I care about transportation. And so what is the front door to your engagement? How can you democratize or find that lowest common denominator when it comes to people coming together to talk about things that are important to them? And what are the typical settings and circumstances that make that possible for different cultures and different groups? Because that is different, which is arguably the definition of culture. Like, that's why things are different, because everyone's backgrounds are different, and we have to acknowledge that if you're trying to achieve a certain outcome, for sure.
Mhm.
So I have one follow-up question before we turn it back
Okay.
up to Noah. We've got lots of jurisdictions on the call. Do you have any recommendations for cities and towns who might be interested in a similar model, similar advisory model of the committee, but
Mhm.
don't have a standing committee?
Yeah. Well, first I'll echo the first thing that we said, which is accessibility to planning, trying to just, break down the concept of urban planning, but what does that look like in your community? It looks like, land use, but what is land use? It's the businesses, it's the sidewalks, it's the, breaking down what does that mean and how it impacts you. What does that look like in Federal Way or Auburn or Edmonds, so that's really big. I think building relationships with community-based organizations and trusted leaders, people who already hold relationships and insight and can help amplify your message. You don't need to build a full committee from scratch to start listening well. Listening is a really underappreciated tool that is really valuable in community. And that's, community-based organizations and leaders of all kinds. They don't need to be community development associations or people that already have that excitement in planning. Those people are probably already engaged, right? So it's churches or small businesses. We are all impacted by planning and land use decisions. And again, having that accessibility around what is land use and how it's impacting them and development and all those things can make that desire to engage from folks a little bit more pertinent and accessible. Because again, sometimes people don't want to engage, and that's also okay. I think another big thing is being transparent about your why. So you've said what the what is planning, but also why should they care and why equity matters in your local context, what you are trying to shift as a town, a city, a county, and what power do those community members actually hold when you're asking them for feedback. Ask yourself before engaging with community, what's the goal? How much will their input actually transform your process? And be straightforward about that, because I think it's not new to many folks on the call that there's been this legacy of structural racism, and PSRC has a great tool on that as well in our communities that really shows up. So that honesty really builds trust, and you have to reckon with that past to build the future together. So I think maybe the last thing would be, resourcing the work accordingly. And I know that ranges, different folks have different budgets. So if you have the capacity and budget to provide stipends, childcare, interpretation, food, compensating people for their time and creating accessible spaces signal that you value their expertise. But also, if that's not feasible, I know some towns, cities, counties may not have those means, but it again circles back to the first aspect of listening and making the work you do accessible and understandable. You always have the resource of time, and you always are able to listen. So make the time to go out and Noah talked about at the beginning, meet people where they are, focus on building those critical connections over a critical mass, just trying to get as many people as possible. So those are definitely some things to think about. Even small jurisdictions can start somewhere. It's less about having a perfect model and more about committing to a different way of working, one that's relational, accountable, and really centered in equity.
No, that's amazing. And as Noah comes back and to talk a little bit about an upcoming engagement pilot, I want to +1 on that engagement, like your time, your voice, your relationships is something that is a lot, available, you can access quickly, or the resources, you don't have to, you control that resource. I would also encourage everyone to keep data on those relationships and track them, and have a strong way of understanding who you have reached out to, what they're offering to help, and what you can offer. I think tracking the themes of those relationships will help you identify those coalitions and that synergy, and then also allows for there to be some institutional redundancy in your jurisdictions, so that, hey, new person, here's our list, and the people that we know and that we go back to, the well that we're drawing from, and that will outlive my career at this place, because we all, as planners, work for places who, we go home every day, but residents, they're in a long-term relationship with this government and their place. And so even after we leave, those relationships and the codification of that is important to continue on and not have these gaps in relationships. So don't undervalue the sign-in sheet. We love a good old-fashioned sign-in sheet. And with that, I will pass it back to Noah.
Yeah, that I don't even know if you realize this, Julia, but there was a question in the chat sort of about how communities with lower resources can connect with community members if maybe not having compensation policies, et cetera. And you really nailed it on the head there. I think thinking too of like remembering that just because a planner or a community or a civic official is not holding a meeting doesn't mean that communities aren't already meeting with each other. So thinking about where those places take place, it can often be a CBO or a nonprofit structure that might have monthly meetings. It could also be a local business, a coffee shop or a restaurant that is really kind of a community space for certain members of community. Going to those places rather than inviting them to your office and saying, hey, being honest about where you're at. I don't have a lot of resources for this, but I understand how important of a community space this is, and I think my work will impact you, and I want to make sure that that's coming from an engagement perspective that reaches out to you. So yeah, thank you both for your words and your lessons that you've taught us over the years. I'm going to finish up here before we open it up for Q&A with kind of some next steps about what PSRC is thinking about for the next iteration of this. We are kind of early on in this process of our EAC subcommittee, but we already know that it's a very successful model and want to keep moving forward to that. So we were thinking about just our role as a regional agency. A lot of it is sharing best practices, sort of guiding our member jurisdictions along, teaching them kind of what we have learned over the years as we've just engaged with community in these processes. Also thinking about how we could tie it back to the Regional Safety Action Plan. When we started that plan, we were thinking about what implementation looked like, and we put some homework for ourselves in that plan to look at what quick build implementation projects across the region might look at and investigate doing some of those to see if we could put together some kind of nimble, low resource projects that immediately contribute to a more safe streetscape and environment. So we think that this is a really nice opportunity to kind of merge those two initiatives together. We're working on fleshing this out right now, but the goal is that next year we'll be able to reach out to a handful of communities across the region, partner with them to develop an engagement strategy that ultimately results in a quick build project. So I think this engagement strategy would look pretty similar to the EAC subcommittee model right now, but figuring out communities across the region that have both concerning statistics from a safety standpoint, but also maybe have a bit of a CBO landscape there that we can connect with, sort of serving as a matchmaker between government officials, those communities, helping them put together their own sort of subcommittee model, a standing committee that meets to talk about engagement and ultimately moving towards a quick build project. If you're not familiar with those look like, it's very low cost, temporary installations that restructure and rethink what a streetscape might look like. Oftentimes, these are bicycle and pedestrian amenities that lead to safer street crossings, just less interaction with cars and other vehicles on the road that might, lead to less safe outcomes for them. So this is still in the early stages, but we want to keep continuing this work, keep developing communities, and really share our best practices that we've learned through these processes, and hopefully put together projects throughout the region that are putting together a similar model to this EAC subcommittee. So stay tuned for that. I look forward to putting together some more outreach and figuring out where those are going to take place and how we partner with community. But that's kind of what's next on the horizon as we continue this progression into community connection. So thank you all for hearing us out today, and I look forward to having some nice Q&A with you all now.
Great. Thanks so much, Noah. Ariam and Julia, if you want to come back online, hello. Yeah, we have some time for a couple of Q&A questions, and I'll remind everybody that the Q&A is open, and I also have a list of questions here that were asked when you registered. So we'll start with some of those and see what other questions come in. One question that was submitted ahead of time, and then we kind of had a follow-up complimentary question during the session today, is thinking about, as public agencies reaching out to community, first of all, how can we coordinate with other public agencies that might be reaching out to similar communities, making sure that the public kind of has a cohesive engagement experience with the public sector when we have, like Julia was mentioning, so many layers of government, potentially trying to reach out to the same people. So maybe any thoughts on that? And then in a similar vein, we talk a lot about community fatigue sometimes from asking too much, being repetitive, asking the community similar things over and over again. So maybe any thoughts from any of you about ways that we can proactively approach that in the public sector?
And maybe I'll take a crack at the first one, but I think that that was sort of the justification at PSRC for creating my role as someone that can kind of be centralized and manage, just keep track of engagement activities and initiatives that are going on. Maybe there's an opportunity for a jurisdiction to appoint someone into a similar sort of role, or at least to kind of keep track of initiatives that you would then coordinate through. If not, even something as simple as like a shared calendar is really helpful to just put different engagement initiatives, plans, an outreach schedule on there, just kind of centralizing resources and understanding like what's going on. I think that also kind of feeds into the second question too with feedback. I do want to hear from the other panelists a little bit more about that on fatigue, but if you know what's going on, then you can consolidate your resources, maybe ask more questions in fewer sessions, kind of a thing. But whether it's an individual or just a way that you manage information and data, I would try to centralize that as much as possible.
Yeah, I think the fatigue question is one that is the that's the $1 million question, right? And I think success that I've seen in the past has mostly been around the coordination of a long-term strategy and attaching that to something maybe a community already does. So a really good example of, I worked in Pittsburgh for a long time, and every year they have the Pittsburgh Marathon. And then every year, right before the Pittsburgh Marathon, a lot of the environmental justice nonprofits get together and do something called Red Up Pittsburgh, which is where every Red Up is like cleanup is a local term, but all of the communities get together to tackle specific projects or initiatives they had been wanting to work on, and using this annual giant spectacle of the marathon as an anchor, so that because people know it's coming, they're used to it kind of being a part of their life, and it's on a normal cadence. And so what can you anchor an idea to, or a long-term initiative to something that people are usually already excited about, and then make kind of sneak your way into there as being and also we're gonna either do something adjacent, or this is connected to this, and here's why, and you're gonna find those unique partnership and unlikely bedfellows if you can try to do that. And then any planning project should start with, here's what we know already happened, here's what we know you said before, and we already read through those survey results, and here's what we pulled from them, and here's what we have a more specific question about. I think that the biggest danger that any engagement process can go into is like, hey, what do you guys think, as the question. If you can avoid that question being part of your question set, the better. It's, hey, we did this thing based on what you asked, and here's some gaps that we can't understand. Hey, we looked into that, and while that's not possible, we're wondering if what you think about this alternative. The more specific you can get and relate to the gaps and shortcomings that you see in your own process, the better, because owning that, being upfront, it goes a long way with relationship building and trust building, I think, and coming to folks and doing that due diligence. So that's what I would say. Julie, I'm really interested in your perspective as well, though.
Yeah, I think what both Noah and Ariam shared is super insightful and true. I think that a lot of it has to come internally in government of reaching out and have to one another before we reach out to the community. Ariam talked about that in terms of like when you before you go, sharing what you already know. And so that can be really hard when, you're not just within one city or town talking to different departments, but you're regional. That's tough. Think some of what Noah shared about trying to create systems and mechanisms. We've been talking a lot about that at King County, and we have a community engagers team across the county of folks in different agencies and departments that do community engagement. And we have one time that we meet once a month. Sometimes it's twice a month. I think the frequency shifts. But then we have, um, this Airtable, how user friendly it is varies, right? You have to kind of get over that hump or learn a new software. It can take some time, but just having at least one software, for example, ours Airtable, but anything that's accessible to folks where people from our parks department, natural resources and parks will say, we're going to be in community on this day. And then people uh, in Metro or in local services or in community and human services or can housing can see, okay, Parks is already going to be there that day. So we can join in on this effort and try to make the most of engagement efforts that are happening. And I think that this can get into, we have the same community members that might be on different committees and checking in with people on their capacity and how they're doing. So continuing to have those open channels of communication and relationship building. But yeah, really, it's on us internally to ensure that we're not overburdening community members. And as a community member, like, checking in with yourself and being sure to communicate that as well. So trying to find some ways to streamline that. I know it's already difficult countywide because then we have all of our jurisdictions in King County. It's a big county, so that is tough. But like Noah said, maybe there's something we can do, and this really plants that seed to coordinating regionally.
Great. Yeah, thank you all. That is very interesting. I really liked your insights on that. Shifting gears a little bit, we've talked about the importance of working with community leaders, and I think a big part of the success of the EAC model at this point has been tapping into folks that know those community connections and community leaders that can connect us with those. For jurisdictions that maybe don't already have a model like that built out, what recommendations would you have for identifying community leaders that are working in their areas or even CBOs that the jurisdiction might not be aware of? Yeah, curious any thoughts on that.
Yeah, we'll definitely take a look at our report. We did a region-wide sort of analysis. This was more specific to groups that were CBOs working in, housing resources and anti-displacement. It is far from perfect. It needs to be updated, but you never know. It might get you a start there. I'm really interested in this product that Ariam, your colleague, is it Carson, put together. It seems like that kind of took our initial idea and sort of supercharged it. So I'm curious to hear more about that, and then if there are ways to expand that to a local jurisdiction.
We're actually in the process of integrating the data you sent over from the coordinated mobility plan as an overlay. So the Equity Advisory Committee members will see that soon at their next meeting. I think that I can't say enough about tracking your data. I just can't say enough about it. And knowing what you do know and knowing what you don't know, and then to address what you don't know, using different and maybe avant-garde ways of finding that out. And so Noah, you talked a little bit about like folks are already meeting. There's already community groups. There's already leaders. You've got to get into that maybe non-traditional space. You've got to some of the best reading I do is on Facebook community groups. Like to the gods, like great narrative commentary. They will tell you who's who you need to talk to. Sometimes a great question is, hey, who do I need to talk to? Who knows everything around here? Like, who knows, who is that community champion that maybe you just need to find a name? Maybe you're not asking anything of anyone yet. You're just trying to identify where are those community centers. And then also observational. Oh, there's a huge group of people that meet every other Sunday over there. I wonder what's happening. Observations and then trying to get access. It's not like it's kind of likened to a lunchroom school or lunchroom tables of people who've got their own things going on. You got to get invited to the table. And there's ways to do that by using humanity. I eat here. Hey, I come here every day. Tell me a little bit about you. Who do you know in the community? Who's doing what? And then tracking that information is important, and sitting with the information you have and drawing connections is key. Finally, compensation, you gotta, opportunity costs is what it's all about. One, making the message that yes, this does affect your life and could positively affect some goals you're trying to achieve. And making that connection with folks, but then identifying that you are competing with other priorities in folks' lives. And because we're all from different cultures and value things differently, we've got to find that common denominator that allows us to value things similarly. And in this capitalist system that we have, that happens to be money. And then when we put value to time, we tell people how serious we are about their input and feedback. And so again, while that's not possible in every scenario, it's an interesting way to start thinking about value judgments. It's like asking for a raise at your job. What other things other than money do people value and can I bring to the table? What other resources can I offer and connections can I offer that would allow and entice someone that, yes, this is an opportunity cost decision that I'm going to make because I think that engaging in this will positively affect my life and goals that I am trying to achieve.
Great, thank you. And kind of drilling in, Ariam, on your comment about data collection. We have a comment that came in during the webinar that's asking about collecting demographic information. So the question is kind of geared towards grants that might be asking about whether or not you've engaged with vulnerable communities. The comment mentions that, in a survey format, it's pretty easy to ask about demographics, but what are some thoughts about ways to frame your discussions with communities if it's more of a tabling interaction or something that's more casual and not something where you're asking someone to fill out, demographic information for you?
Yeah, I think that this is again where art and creativity work. I've had really great experiences inviting live artists to events to draw a picture of who's in the room. I mean, you can take a picture, but we've also had folks have had experiences where we get a poet to come and to basically write a live poem of the room and to capture the nuances of who's there and what people are saying and what's important. There's a story to be told there. Attach that to your grant application or your report. So other ways is through maybe more interactive data collection. So an idea I'm kind of working on right now is about identifying priorities in passing. So if someone's at a table and you're asking what is most important? I don't know if you've ever seen those put a quarter here, they have cups for different options and you can put a quarter in the one you're voting for. Penny wars, some schools are fundraisers it's called. But what if that actual token you're using said something about your identity? So let's say you've got red means this, orange means that, whatever, and you pick up one that feels most matches your identity, or you pick up the few that you feel most match your identity, and then you go place your priority tokens somewhere. And so you're literally able to see the mosaic of who answered and what identity they identified with and where they put their coins. They're in a very just picking up some marbles and dropping them in a different place. And so trying to think about what are like really low tech things you can do in that fashion. Candy's great. No, you can't overcome candy bowl at your activity and someone playing marbles. It's like, how can you turn those things people are naturally drawn to, or this aspect of like another concept I'm really interested in, Tim Beatley, you should look him up. He's trying to develop a unit of awe, like, oh, bubbles have a unit of awe of 5 versus like Yosemite and a sunset, that's an awe level of like 15. And it's like, how can you in engagement start to understand if I have these elements available in my space and engagement, people are going to experience this, and I'm all for bubbles and chalk and music and food. And like, how can we again prove to funders this works? And here's how, because I use these tactics and I got these outcomes, and people are studying it because there's a unit of awe, and it starts to take some of these fuzzy ideas of engagement and put them into more concrete terms.
Great. Yeah, that sounds really fun. I love those ideas. And now I'm thinking about our RTP tabling and ways that we could integrate things like that. So great feedback. We've had quite a few questions, both during registration and coming up during the webinar. Curious to hear any thoughts on the federal climate that we're in right now. And there's a couple of ways that the questions have approached this from. Some people wondering about, the impacts of community members' willingness to engage and, feel trust in engaging with a government entity at this time. People curious about, thoughts as practitioners, how we can continue this work. So yeah, curious if anybody has any thoughts that they would like to share.
Yeah, it's a really challenging question, a really challenging moment. Obviously, we're talking about the Equity Advisory Committee, like we're moving forward business as usual. We're not changing the name of that committee. These are some conversations that are a little bit above my head, but I know that we've gotten sort of creative about how we fund certain things. Our compensation policies and things like that are coming more from our local funds rather than our federal grants. But I think this really underscores the need to meet people where they are, as they're perhaps feeling less and less comfortable coming out and engaging with a government agency. But it's a dynamic time for all of us, and we're having a lot of conversations about how to do this too. But we're committed to moving forward doing this work as much as possible as we always have. So I'll open it up to you other two.
Yeah, I think that this is super tough. And tying back to what we're talking around, demographics, people don't want to opt in and self-identify. There's a lot of communities right now, especially undocumented folks, our trans community, that are really not feeling safe right now for obvious and clear reasons. And so, respecting that and maybe offering and being mindful of where you post and share that we're gathering. That's something we've been thinking about with King County. There's been, more sightings or discussions around ICE in our community. And when you are saying we're going to be gathering here, we want your feedback from diverse community, be mindful of that and be aware of it. And what ways can you resource and secure your event to make sure community members feel safe? I know some folks at the county had immigration lawyers also attend, right? So that people felt safer. But again, the reality is, as Noah said, the attendance is lower and there is that fear. So while we do want to capture that data and demographic data, also realizing that sometimes we're kind of going to have to shift and giving people the option to not select or choose anonymous can also increase their engagement and feeling like they can trust and still provide that feedback because at the end of the day, we are a government agency and our data collection across, from PSRC all the way down, that can be requested. So that's tough. So just being mindful of that and again, being open to shift and noting that as you're collecting data, back to RM's point, maybe writing in this period, being transparent about what's been happening and how that might be impacting your trends and impacting community.
The only other thing I would say is that trying to find additional ways, ideally using technology or as much, and trusted messengers, so low tech and high tech, to collect data. So an example is we've most recently been trying to use a survey tool that allows us to collect data or feedback from written standpoint, but also you can record your voice. And that has helped us to overcome language barriers, reading level barriers, as well as it's anonymous and you can submit. And so one thing we did in a different project is we set up our libraries with the tool so that they could connect with people one-on-one, explain, here's what's happening. Would you like to submit this? I can help you set this up. And so it's not necessarily requiring someone to use it on their personal device, as like lots of people are wary of the way that IT is being used to track them, but we can coordinate with and support the people on the front lines already supporting people. Because I think the importance is if that's what's desired is an erasure from, especially from planning processes, right? If you're not there, you won't get planned for. And so we're trying to overcome and almost be resilient against some maybe retreats in inclusive participation by saying this is almost the most important time that we need that feedback and we need that access to communities and we need their voices to be heard and or documented and their stories to be told, and that trusted community institutions and people who are already willing to take that risk and are already taking those risks as protectors and frontline protectors, incentivizing them, partnering with them, and understanding how can I get this information to and from this community so we can codify efforts through plans to support broader equity engagement. So yeah, it's I can't emphasize enough that community relationships, the infrastructure, and finding the activists and the folks who are willing to and are taking those risks in protection of community and finding out where do your interests overlap. There's not always there's not everywhere there's overlapping, but there's definitely resources that you can share and at least at the very least do some deep listening, to Julia's point, and build your own knowledge if there's nothing you can offer.
Great. Yeah, really appreciate the three of you sharing those thoughts. We are just about at the end of our webinar. Time flies, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen one last time and just wrap us up here. But really, thank you so much, Noah, Ariam, and Julia for being here today. Really appreciated the conversations. And let me get that screen shared. Before I let all of you go and enjoy your lovely Friday, just wanted to say once again that we will be having our next toolbox session focused on transportation safety planning. So like I mentioned at the beginning, a lot of the engagement that we talked about today, we'll be talking more about the actual transportation planning side. So looking forward to that. Mark your calendars. And then at this time, I will ask Michaela to share our final survey here. I want to remind you all that you are eligible to claim an AICP equity credit if you are interested. So I have the code there. You can also find more information just by searching the name of the webinar on the APA website. And I will be sending out an email with information about some of the resources we talked about today, along with a recording of the webinar next week. Finally, we also have our Title VI survey that will pop up when you leave this webinar. So if you have time and are able, we'd appreciate your feedback there. With that, I will go ahead and say thank you very much for joining today. And yeah, hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you, everybody.